Good evening and welcome to the February 2025 edition of Austin Software Cooperatives. We are starting a review of a new book, Radical Companies Without Bosses or Employees, written by Matt Perez and Adrian Perez. The way that we normally do this is I'll go through, I have a mind map here, and I go through a couple portions of the first couple chapters and I'll stop and we can discuss. And so this mind map will help people to follow along. Anybody has any questions, just jump right in and ask. But let's go ahead and start. So this book, um, the first, I think before I even get into the chapters, what I what we're going to do is separate this book into three portions because the book is naturally separated into three parts. So it's a group of chapters, six chapters, but they're kind of small. So I think we can get through them. If we don't get through in an hour or so, then we can break it up in more. It seems to work the best for everyone from experience. And so let's move into this. But generally speaking, though, the overview of my of this book, it is a little bit different than what I thought it was going to be. Um, with the without bosses, my preconceived notion, which I tend to try to form one just so that I can be pleasantly surprised or not. Um, it keeps me on my toes when I'm reading a book. This this one, I kind of just from the title, I thought that there was this is going to go along the kind of maybe the normal thinking of bringing employees into the decision making process, but not fully, and as a way to be a better, um, more mindful and polite boss, let's say, manager, and the benefits of that would be to get better buy-in. But it's not that. It does take extra steps. It talks about ownership and bringing people into um, more of the what I would call the directive decisions of the business. And we've reviewed a bunch of books that talk about this, so I was pleasantly surprised. So let's any comments so far or questions?
I think I kind of share your same sentiment, Watson. I was a bit pleasantly surprised with kind of the direction that he was taking with the book because it did seem to be focused more upon like a true co-op, like direct democracy type of business model. So I thought it was pretty interesting. I got through like most of the book, so I'm hoping to like kind of dive into some of the details, I guess, with you guys. So yeah, it was a pleasant surprise. I agree.
Great, great. Yeah. So we have it separated into three portions. So probably, I'm not 100% sure we may get through the first part or first part one, but hopefully we do. All right. Okay. So the book starts out that, generally speaking, the first portion of the book, it talks about the author's experience in trying to build a different company, what they call a radical company. And it brings you along that path. So it's kind of like almost like a memoir of business, which we've reviewed a book like that called Companies We Keep last year. So this is similar with that style, and I think that that's a very useful style to talk about these things. So, okay, so let's have this definition here. Radical companies owned and managed by the people who embody them and give them life. Okay. Um, a critique of there's various critiques of how business is done now, capitalism, so on and so forth, how hierarchies form in this part one of this book. one of the, I guess, one critique here um, we have that there's a wealth gap based on how businesses are developed now and how society is developed now. And they're saying, kind of a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it's true. The biggest issue is not really the wealth gap, but the fact that we accept it as inevitable. And I kind of appreciate this type of critique. Um, they have a an argument here that um, many people alive today live in financial splendor compared to the royalty of previous centuries. So even compared to the royalty of previous centuries. So basically, the standard of living has increased, in the past 500 years, and um, and that's kind of what they're putting forth as saying it's not really the wealth gap. I mean, it's kind of the argument of who cares if somebody's a trillionaire somewhere, but the idea of that there isn't something better, a better way to distribute things or work, right? To optimize things in some other way, that this is the only way. Uh, that's the problem. So I kind of sympathize with that. Um, and so that's why they wrote this book. It's for people who want to live in a more just world than the one we live in today. And this word just, talking about morality, probably distributive justice, these types of um, ideas within ethics and things like that, these intuitions, sympathize with all of those things. So, um, again, this is kind of the introduction, what's called the beginning. Uh, we see companies as places where lots of exploration and experiments will take place. This is going to come back later on, an intuition that was in the book that I thought was very useful. Um, and saying the book is separated into three parts. The part that we're going to be going over is really um, the part of their story near soft. This is a real life business that they developed. All right. So any questions so far before I go into this? All right.
Yep.
Let's do this once upon a time. This first part, I think I'm going to try to skim through. So we got near soft on the high level. It's well, let's talk about let's before I go into that. Let's go here. Operating without bosses or titles or ranked hierarchy sounds impossible, but it works. Personally, in my experience, that's the same types of arguments and pushback that I get as well. Like how can you operate without the smart person on top and control? So it's good to hear and see other people wrestling with how they communicate this, and that's what this book is really about, at least this portion. So, for a sustainable solution, we need to address the issue of ownership. It's definitely a it, it's definitely a thing that needs to be addressed. I put a very high priority on the ownership part. Now, whether it's within the morality of it, I have lots of arguments on the morality, and that would be the thrust of it. But there's also like a pragmatic view of if you don't give people ownership, then all of it doesn't work as well. We're probably going to be talking about both. Many have tried to turn private businesses into public ones and have the government own them all, but those systems have always ended up as dictatorships. So here we have decentralized ownership is central to liberty. I know this from my own experience with the alternative. amazing. Okay, this is good. So without bosses, instead of today's because I say so, that's what fiat management is. So they use the term fiat a lot, which just means by decree. And so their way of reasoning about this is to say that current management, current businesses, they are by decree, kind of going back to the time of royalty where the divine right of kings by decree, it's basically a divine right. So God is telling, okay, this king, you need to do what they say, and it's all authoritative and just. It comes from God, and then it flows on down to you. This by decree um, argument, they're using that to try to reason about current management and how it works, and then the alternative, which would be more of a decentralized management, ownership, these types of things. Um, Places where people can experience co-ownership, so decentralized ownership, instead of fiat ownership, are what they want to create, and so they call those radical companies. So this is now we're going to get into a little bit of the background. So Nearsoft was a software development company. They were doing some. They started working on the management, more on the management side instead of the developing software, just the development software side. So they were starting to outsource. So this is kind of the story of the '90s and early 2000s, and they went through the iterations and evolutions of um, outsourcing in different ways and finding out that there's some you can run into some error, some struggle, some pushback there, and then they said, okay, well, we may outsource, we may near source or would have you with Mexico, and so they started doing that, and so this they found another company that called the C Cube team. They worked together with them in order to make Nearsoft, and this ended up being a winning combo for business. But and then they started um, reasoning about how to make a better um, company work environment, these types of things that they thought would be more fair. So that's all that portion. Let's see. Here I find this to be this responsibility versus authority. I think as an overview for myself, every employee, you're working somewhere, you run into something that may irk you, and you feel like this is a fundamental problem that could be fixed within this company or just in business in general. This responsibility versus authority was the author's kind of a wake up call here. So they were working at Sun, they were doing really well, and they were allowed freedom to take initiative and make decisions. So they were saying at one portion they had, at one time they had responsibility and authority. Then they got promoted to being a bigger boss at over operating systems, so Solaris, and it increased their responsibility increased, but they didn't have an increase in authority. And me, I'm saying, but this is a common saying within like libertarian circles and other circles. Responsibility without authority is slavery. If you're responsible for some field to make sure the corn grows there, but you don't have any authority of how to do any of it, and then how the profit or surplus, how that's distributed or anything, then that would be another definition of slavery. But um, the author ran into that, and they describe it as the reason why they couldn't, even though they knew the solution to the problem, which was trying to break up how they're developing the software, how they're delivering the software, rather. They weren't allowed the, they didn't have the authority to make those decisions, even though they're responsible. So it's basically their fault when the software was late, but they couldn't change it. right? And um, so the lesson they took away is that responsibility and authority are essential, not only for working effectively with others, but for the personal feeling of satisfaction. I think that this is also another part. So being responsible for software delivery, but having little authority to make changes left me very frustrated, and that gave an inkling of what others might feel when when he unilaterally snatched away their ability to act independently. Also, so this reasoning about how the workplace and how we're participant in reproducing the mechanics of the workplace, we're complicit in it, and thinking about it, and some you can take two directions. You can choose to rationalize it, and then you figure out how to ignore it and deal with it and be a 9 to 5er. And then, you could call that the blue pill if you want. And then there's the other side where it's, oh, well, maybe we can do this differently. And this was their pathway for figuring out, how they describe it, this giving people authority when they have the responsibility. This is, their pathway of figuring out, hey, we should be doing business in a different way. Any questions so far on this first chapter? So these are pretty small chapters.
Are you sharing something, Watson, or are you being?
Oh, yes. I thought I was thought I was sharing. Did it go away?
Yeah, I don't see the mind map. I think I saw it earlier, but all I see is your icon. I'm not sure if Gage may be seeing the same thing. There we go.
Huh. Well, hopefully
Yeah, I see the mind map.
now you see it. When did it stop?
I haven't seen it since the beginning.
Oh,
Sorry.
man, that
That's all right.
sucks. Yeah. All right. I'll cut that part out. So that's chapter one. Let's go on to chapter two. Um, so anyone who has started a company, so this is a different approach to management. So anyone that's who has started a company knows that it's critical for the founders to be aligned when it comes to priorities and values. Right? Everyone should enjoy their work, and sharing the wealth was the foundation of the company. This is, and then we didn't want to be bosses. We didn't want employees. We didn't want titles. We didn't want to hide information about the company, so on and so forth. This here, when starting any type of radical, I'll use their term like a radical company, radically different. It's, you know, it kind of thinks like, obviously, I mean, people can sit around like a bunch of friends. The way I describe it is like, hey, we're all smart. We can start, and then XYZ company. It could be a bakery. You all been baking all your life or cooking. It could be a software company or what have you. You think, yes, we can do these things where we all work and we share things um, equitably and all this other stuff. It's kind of like it seems intuitive and almost even seems easy to do. Um, and so this is kind of like this eureka moment that comes from the author's view. It came from this responsibility without authority. um, they hit the 2009 crisis, which I found to be really interesting. So it was they weren't making enough money, and it started to be one of those things where um, we're gonna have to let people go. And they said they did the most democratic thing. They put it to a vote. In their space, they don't really. He said that they don't really vote that much on things. They tend to do consensus and other things or committees. but they did do a vote, and then they said, "Oh, let's form a committee, and the committee can decide who was in and who was out." And the founders, so Roberto and the other founder, they stayed out of the process, and then the committee they decided what to do. So what they originally, I don't have it here, but originally they decided, hey, let's just take a haircut. So like within cooperatives, normally one of the features of cooperatives is people get together and they say, like, hey, let's all take a reduction in pay. And so cooperatives empirically have been shown to actually be more resilient than regular structures as far as staying within, staying in business. Because one of the strategies is they decide not to cut fire a bunch of people. They keep the people. Everyone decides, and they're part of the decision. They decide, hey, let's take a cut of pay. Um, One company, Mondragon, is famous for going through 2008 without um, firing anyone, even though they have like 100,000 employees. So it's kind of a feature of employee-owned businesses. But they said they kind of went a different route. They said, okay, we're going to make a committee and you all decide. And so they ended up doing that. So this is their learning process of how to behave, how to reason about, think about employee-owned company. They talk about this book, Maverick. I have this book. This came out a long time ago. It's all about, a business of it's created in Brazil. One of the features of the book is letting people decide their own hours of operation, instituting profit sharing, having workers sit on board meetings, and opening books and training people to make sense in them. So they started reasoning more about this decentralized decision making and all the stuff, reading different books about how do we do this where we don't have bosses. That's kind of a language that they like, this decentralized decision making. He came up with this idea of in language called a leadership team, a lightweight mechanism for decentralized decision making, and they implemented that. The only rule is that the team had to be transparent and publish their minutes and conclusions. He, I've run into this myself as well from people that aren't used to employee ownership or being part of any type of democratic process as far as decision making. The word leadership is somewhat confusing for new people, and they assume it has to do with Roberto and me, the founders. They don't immediately recognize that they are the leaders and they are the ones who bring people together in a leadership team at any time for any purpose. Right. So it can be very difficult for people to accept that they they have the responsibility of making decisions, and it can actually be anxiety inducing because people are used to someone making decisions um, for them, taking care of them, or whatever, what they may think. But at the same time, it's a paradox. It's like, well, this person is probably not making the best decisions. Uh, Let me be a part of it, or let me have some insight to it. But just even being a part in the room, it can create anxiety if you are now responsible. And so uh, that is a struggle I found for people. And this is like a learning process, bringing people in to the decision making process in any endeavor, but business definitely. Let's see here. So now it's going to earn dividends. So this, let's say, plenty of the books that we reviewed. Um, There was a book that we reviewed from a cooperative called Inspiral in New Zealand, and they had it was the same format. It's basically a memoir of how they developed, and the whole how you do profit sharing, how you do dividends, how you do pay, all of that stuff. That is at some point in time, people when they think about that, they think, oh, that's where it's all going to fall apart. How are you going to figure that part out? Of course, you need to have the smart person on top decide everybody gets this or what have you. And this is their wrestling with that portion. So at the very start, they share the dividends, but the formula for sharing was made by one person. And then eventually, 2014, they said, we have this leadership team concept. Let's go ahead and change it because we don't understand it. And so they came up with a new formula. And basically, it was they were going to do proportionality uh, play. Basically, it's going to be one end of whatever the profit is, right? So essentially, if there's 10 people, it's going to be 1/10 to everybody. Well, and people think about that and they're like, of course, some of the things that jump to mind, wait a minute, you know, what about all the years I spent going to school? So this person is saying that I'm more valuable to the team. Um, and then of course it's going to be, people saying, oh, I contributed more. I did all this stuff, right? Normal arguments that come, that kind of thing. And so the way that they reasoned about it, and ended up being that simplicity at this stage of doing the profit sharing, simplicity was better than having a more complicated um, method for doing the dividends. And then it ended up being about trust. And then so when you develop trust, which I'm kind of a stickler about this word. So is trust earned or do you develop? And they literally, they said develop. So this process, when you figure out working with other people and you're learning how to trust them, part of the problem is solved as you're working out the problem. Part of it is solved because you learn to trust people, and some of it just falls away. So this is their reasoning that, oh, we're gonna trust and I'm gonna get ahead. I think no, like this freeloading portion. One of the things that jump out. Oh, what if somebody's just lazy, or they decide to be lazy? Kind of. What if they decide to be lazy? What do you do if you have this rule that says it's always a one and everyone, egalitarian split? You're going to have freeloaders, which is this portion here. Well, this trust portion goes into that. And so how do you deal with that? We're going to get to that. Um, okay. And then this, I would say, it's worth noting that an equitable distribution is a goal, not equality. Wasn't I within there's a field called fair division, plenty of books on this within, let's say, estate planning and distribution, and it's also within game theory. Um, Equitability and egalitarianism or equality are two different things where some people might think it is the same. And it's interesting that they ended up putting this note in here. But let's say if somebody does more and they could get more, that's equitable. But e- equality is no matter what anybody does, everybody gets the same. So that's always going to be the knee jerk reaction to profit sharing. How do you deal with this? Is there going to be people who are freeloaders? That's always going to be a part of the discussion. And it's going to be the pushback of course, it can't work because you can't work that out. You definitely can work this out. So, They also on this chapter reasoning about what is it that motivates people. He's saying profit sharing actually doesn't really motivate people. He's saying that you have your annual bonus, but people go back to doing what's expected of them as a means of motivating them, controlling their actions, modifying their behavior to fit the needs of the organization. The annual bonus doesn't work. So another, there's plenty that's written about this. Forgetting some books that we reviewed on it, but basically after kind of generally speaking, the heuristic is after around 80 to 100,000 a year, people don't care anymore about compensation. Regular, normal people, the average person doesn't care as much about compensation as they care about, say, mastery of their craft, autonomy, so being able to decide what they do, and purpose. So is what they do, does it make a dent in the world, right? Does it make a difference? They care about those three things more. And so that intuition is captured in this whole, do you pay people? Now, there are people who are driven by profit, and that's not the average person. It's like a very small, but it has to be, the person has to feel like they're not being ripped off. So a certain amount of money, and again, now I don't know what the number is, but 15 years ago, it was like 80,000. Paying someone 90,000, it doesn't really motivate them much more than the other things I was saying. Drive is the book, and I want to say the name of the guy is Daniel Pink. I can't remember. I think we reviewed that book a long time ago. So we have the freeloading, a question that comes up regularly about freeloading. How do you prevent people from taking advantage of it all? Short answer is that freeloading does not happen in co-managed companies like Nearsoft. The freeloaders co-workers in a regular business, the freeloaders co-workers don't care to report it when they see it. So his argument is that in a co-owned, co-managed business, your peers are going to correct you because it's their money that uh, is being stolen from them, or however you want to say it, with the freeloader. So there's more correction built in because people have skin in the game because they're having profit sharing. So they're saying they didn't experience freeloading. Now, I will say that you definitely can have what I would call problem children. Uh, that that you should at some point. Again, this is part of the learning process. You're going to have to figure out how to deal with someone who's a problem child, and it's like what they reference in here. I think they said in freeloading in a few cases where people are not delivering on what they're promised or repeatedly giving the dog ate my homework kind of excuses, there was something else going on that led to that behavior. This is definitely my experience in the case. It's not laziness or evil intent. Freeloading is usually a symptom, not the disease. That. So people can have something going on in personal life, whatever, and they could have a whole 6 months or longer where they're just not they're not performing. And in a regular business, they're just fired. Like they don't even last that long. But in a co-managed, you have the opportunity to probably dig in and figure out a way to solve the problem in other ways. So any comments about this chapter?
It's really nice to hear how they work through it, and then how there's kind of an aspect of self-regulation that I'd never even considered. Um, I think if someone has to take an extended sick leave and they really care about the company, they might even consider individually taking a pay cut, um, because they worry about the health of the company. So, for example, also when people are, you say somebody's freeloading, one might get upset because they're literally, in a sense, taking their money. but they might also be upset because they really care about the company. So I think care needs to factor in as a virtue that should be celebrated in such structures.
Yeah, 100%. Um, it's quite interesting. The dynamic is much closer to like a family. I won't say it is a family, but it's much closer. Like you're not going to, you got your brother or sister, and maybe you're the senior, you're the older. You're just not gonna let them starve to death. The problem you got is like if they're a problem child and they're doing things
Yeah,
where it's like it's more like that, and then that it is rare. It is rare, but it can happen. And I will also say that these types of businesses, they do attract the kind of person that um they possibly, if you're not careful, they possibly can be manipulative. So um that's problem. Like those the types of person, I would say not just manipulative, but manipulative, and they could be lazy, they could be whatever, but or they're just not as performant as someone else. So it's good to
so,
have like a I would say a probationary period where you just get to know a person. You just don't let people in and hey, we're paying you whatever and you're here forever and you own everything, whatever. It, but I think the point of these style books and stories, memoirs and all that is you learn that as you go. So it ends up working because you end up, if you don't learn that, you fail because you'll have a problem child who does something where it could just bring the business down. So you end up learning.
yeah, I think that's what I meant by self-correcting. The learning is also, learning is self-correcting, basically.
Yeah.
You could take a model from a different aspect of social life, such as a game, like a soccer game, and where you have different motivational structures, but you assume that all the players care about the team or they wouldn't be playing. Like if you weren't pulling your weight, then you kind of get phased out. And that normally is done by the captain. But I could see if you didn't have a captain, the players would collectively come to the decision that, hey, this is just not working. And I'm assuming in these radical companies, you would also have the ability to fire somebody based on a quorum or some sort of agreement among the rest of the members.
Yeah, it's true. And then this part again, I'll go back to the original part, the very beginning. Where is that? This beginning, this portion right here. This the fact that we accept it as inevitable. That's so important because they um people will think that, well, how are you going to fire someone? Well, obviously, I mean, you need to have a smart person in charge that does all that. And then they say, so it's inevitable that you have to have these hierarchies, what they call it fiat management. And no, you you all can get together after you have enough pain. But our motto is you're not gonna do you're not gonna do anything until you have enough pain, right? And then I always I brought up on the book reviews before, whatever, but Winston Churchill, I would talk about United States Americans will do the right thing. They'll always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. That's what it seems like in these types of where you have group committees, these types of things. But you do learn, and the benefit is it's a organizational learning, so you all learn, and then it's not just one person knowing, it's all of you, and after you all learn, you're faster.
And you
So
all become teachers. You all become teachers
yep.
and mentors. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, that's another very, very good lesson as well. Uh, you all can reproduce yourselves instead of one person being able to reproduce. That is definitely it.
So if
Um,
you lose a boss, for example, the company in a sense could go in chaos while the other new boss is, coming in with that learning curve, or maybe coming in with a different style that doesn't jive with everybody. You got some discontent, some people leave, that creates more chaos. It doesn't seem like a very homeostatic system, whereas this seems like it has a built-in homeostasis.
yeah, 100%. Super resilient. It's very resilient. Now, what people within that are on, believers in employee ownership, democratic processes, and group learning, all this stuff like that. I will to, the other side of the argument is what I used to say is you're not going to get a Steve Jobs. You're not going to get an Elon. You're not going to get a, very rarely are you going to have, I know that we may just say that those guys, they're not really high performers anyways or whatever. You're not going to get I would say Wozniak, from Apple. High performer, not a sociopath, whatever. I make an argument you're probably not going to get a Wozniak within these spaces because it's just so easy and so the lure is so strong to the more exploitative companies where the profit margins are really high and those high performers are super compensated more so, right? So where everyone else is exploited, but this person is getting, you know, be a come up. We were talking about these numbers, billionaire kind of thing, without even being the founder or the main person or whatever. Um, those types of companies, it's really hard, and then even within empirical studies and stuff like that, it's the there's a brain drain, is what they call it. If you have people who are overachievers, there is a really strong draw to the high profit for those. Um, Especially if you found a diamond in the rough and they are the type of person that if you're in a field that um, it isn't like an assembly line where one person can be maybe twice as good, like you can screw put in a bolt twice as fast as someone else or whatever, but if you're in a field where someone can be 50 times more efficient than another person, it's it can be difficult outside of pure altruism, the person wanting to be a part of a employee ownership type thing. It's really hard to keep them. It's possible, but it's definitely difficult.
Oh,
And it
what's
may.
it?
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about that is, like, let's say you have somebody that's truly outstanding. Um, this is a dynamic process, so people in the group are going to recognize that. I mean, if you put a bunch of people together, certain things emerge, and usually the group respects that. So, I mean, of course, if we reduce everything to profit, that's a little bit thin. But in terms of building something that's strong and durable, um, and there's, in a sense, not just capital, but symbolic capital or meaningful capital, meaning respect and prestige.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you feel like you're contributing a lot to a company and you're disrespected, sometimes it doesn't matter how much you're going to get paid. You're just like, fuck this. Um,
Oh,
but if you feel as though what you're doing is really appreciated across the board, that's a quality of life thing. I also would argue that the artifacts that you create or the technologies that you create literally have a different sort of flavor to them than if you're one like, okay, well, what can I do to maximize the profit the most? What kind of, in a sense, technology is something you use? You, um, systems of doing things. So an interesting study would be to see what is generated, the actual, what is actually generated is different in different, in different organizational structures. If you're in a cutthroat structure, organizational structure, you're going to maybe create different things, or maybe look even at the market that your company's competing in differently. So that's I don't know how you would empirically study that, but I guess you could just simply see what a radical company would yield as opposed to when it's extremely cutthroat, where in a sense no one gives a damn about the workers. It really has everything to do with the product and what you produce.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
anyway, those are just some free thoughts going on there. But thank you for the summary.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. We've got we got like 10 more minutes. We'll probably get through two more of these. Let's see here. So they got good news. This part was kind of shocking, but it's also a learning process. They basically, a buyer found them and they said, "Oh, we want to buy you." Now, what was shocking is, but this is the learning process. The two founders decided, "Oh yeah, we're gonna sell," and they didn't include everyone else in the decision. This is I'm learning about the decision making process, right? But they said, hey, other people, they weren't, they continued to have a job. Some people got paid because a lot of them had shares. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But they ended up learning that co-management is not enough, and they learn they need to have a model of ownership that went beyond financial benefits. So that was the this process, the buying process seemed to push them along those lines, that learning. Um, so that there's that portion. Um, let's see here. They have some stats here. Most people are unhappy at work. Capitalism tends to be broken. He's saying, well, how's it broken? People are just dissatisfied at work and are not feeling fulfilled. Um, there's also, massive inequality. Now, the author talks about, which I appreciate, I agree with, the struggle of what do you do about it? And they have various stories about how people have tried to transform ownership and distribute, going back to use their language like responsibility and authority. Um, the big obstacle to this transformation is our current concept of ownership. This is my business, not yours. We call that fiat businesses. The hierarchy is an oligarchy with directors, and they're just basically saying this is like going back to royalty. Um, so they said we need to change that. Most businesses are run like feudal estates and stuff like that. So this is the fiat apocalypse, they're saying. So now this portion I find to be really, I it's one of my big takeaways from personally from the book. They use a analogy with pirates, interestingly enough. So he's saying that businesses are envisioned as war machines. A lot of business books are written about like in a competitive standpoint. You take Sun Tzu and then say instead of the terrain, you've got the market, these types of things. You got troops, those employees, all that stuff. And they're saying you need to step away from the economy that's dependent on perpetual war. Well, what do you mean by that? So you got pirates. Okay, in a pirate ship, the captain retained absolute authority in times of battle. The rest of the time, the navigator could argue with the captain all day long, and the sailors could vote for a destination other than the one favored by the captain. I didn't know this. I didn't know there was any of this. This is one of those things where this is so fantastic sounding. I need to go fact check it. but but yeah, there was this concept, and they're saying there's a time where if you need a I'm is my language, if you need a hierarchy, you need speed, okay, fine. Make it to where if you want to have a committee, if you want to have some person in charge of that, whatever it is, go ahead and have that. But the default should be experimentation. And this goes back to what was in the original, like the beginning introduction of the book. Businesses are going to be a place for experimentation, and that people are more involved, buy in, and feeling more fulfilled when they are able to make their own decisions and experiment. So fiat businesses are engaged in a perpetual war. So they're always in the portion where, oh, the captains, top down hierarchies, command and control. And all they see is enemies. You're an employee, you're always in battle mode. And people have internalized this constant state of battle. Of peacetime. So they give some examples of this was a famous, if you all know of Gore-Tex. Gore-Tex, the company, the company didn't have any bosses or assigned teams, and they made each unit into 150 person work units, where everybody that's it tends to be that within humans we tend to have this the 150 number seems to be like a boundary where people tend to you're able to self-govern and all of these things kind of without a stringent hierarchy and all the stuff like that. Gore-Tex is set up that way, and of course they're a very successful $1 billion company, all that kind of stuff. But the argument is that they're kind of more the peacetime instead of wartime. Um, and so let's move over here real quick. I think we can finish up. So decentralized ownership. We used to have kings, decentralized owner, and then you have the United States as an example. You started having more decentralized uh, decision making process with the democratic process. But um, it enshrined private property as the basis of liberty. The power that previously had been reserved for King George was now in the hands of the Society of Kings. So the owners of land, the owners of the people. And so, how do you deal with that? The main argument that they're going through is saying that, oh, well, here's an this I found this interesting. So the founders knew about co-ownership as well. So they said basically there was a situation that came up with ship owners where um, there were some failing portions of the industry and all this stuff like that. And they said, okay, we'll give you a tax cut, but you need to have profit sharing between the ship owners and the crews. And that ended up working really well. And you had Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson going and knowing and being knowledgeable about this profit sharing enough to vote on and implement this tax cut based on that. So people knew about co-ownership and profit sharing. You have Peter Drucker's critique of him, who's probably the most, that's basically the founder of management consulting, and all of his books very influential. He's saying, hey, the bosses will be able to figure out and be as a force for good. And they're saying, oh, well, it didn't happen. So we need something else. You got Karl Marx saying the proletariat. So that's the workers. Hey, we're going to make it to where we're going to, by coercion and government, have um, cooperation and all that stuff, and saying, okay, well, that didn't work out well with Stalin killing everybody or whatever. And then there's this other person called George saying basically, I found this interesting, kind of an intuitive thing, that the rent from land should accrue or be given to society, not to the landowners. Why? Well, if you have a piece of land, you could have a home built out and all that work. That's the fruit of your labor. You should get profit from that, whatever. But the land itself, if you have all of your neighbors building up their homes and all that stuff, the value of your property, the actual land, actually goes up to effort that isn't yours. So it's actually the community that actually builds up the value of your land. So reasoning this way is saying that the lands, whatever value, so you could call it the lot's value is actually community value, and whatever profit that goes from that, that should go to the community. So basically, an argument for property tax, I guess. It just seems very much. Um, they didn't mention that here, but that's what it seems like. Now, is your property tax spent wisely? That's up to you. But kind of a good rational. I think I found it to be a persuasive argument for property tax on the lot. I first heard, yeah, and so they talk about George, and they're saying, okay, this is an argument for this more within the business. How do you share, do profit sharing, and all this type of thing? Keep in mind, it isn't just based off of what you do, the value of, let's say, your business or what have you. It's the joint effort, not just yourself, kind of thing. And saying that they're a very strong argument. They're saying they're taking the position government rules, regulations for creating um, more cooperative, more co-ownership, more co-management is the language they use. Uh, Businesses, probably not the way. They're saying that it should be organic. We need to make our businesses this way, and that's the way, because the top basically saying a top-down method using taxes, using other things, is probably going to end up, you're going to be in a hierarchy, and it's going to be by decree and all that stuff. And you need to have this learning process where you learn how to do all these things. So, yeah, they talk about employee stock ownership, basically argument from the George thing. So that's the last thing. We got through all of it. Any questions, comments?
I do think it's interesting how he talks about the kind of the, I guess, the language of war that's used within like certain, the fiat business. But I would also suggest that if you work in like a large corporation, they kind of co-opt a lot of this language around a radical company as well, because they're really concerned about like employee engagement and
Mm-hmm.
making employees like owners of their work and accountability and that sort of thing. So I feel like I hear a lot of that, within the corporate environment as well, but it all feels like smoke and mirrors
Yep.
sort of thing. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. So we reviewed a book called Participatory Democracy, like maybe 2 years ago. Carol Pateman, very very influential to me. But there's a portion of the book where they talk about different forms of participation, and what they found out is that, oh, management, traditional companies, and so on and so forth, but companies love participation so long as you don't have decision making
Mm,
capability. So having people buy in, like just being in on the meeting, is a great way to get buy-in. And it's a great way basically to exploit people, because you get them like a top-down hierarchy where you're being cutthroat, being what have you. You have passive resistance. But when you have, and if you read all of the change management revolution books and all this stuff like that, it's all about what in the participatory democracy book talks about is pseudo participation. So you have pseudo participation, you have partial participation, you have full participation. Pseudo is when you have no decision making, a binding decision making power. So you're basically sitting in, you're giving feedback. The manager's saying, hey, what do you all think about this? Well, I'll take what you're saying in consideration. That kind of thing. Um, then you have more of a partial participation where there's some kind of decision making, binding decision making power, and it could be implemented different ways. And full is all of you vote, let's say. Like you have some kind of, it's most likely implemented in a kind of like a vote. If you have the partial, like let's say the manager has veto power, or the management, that partial is there. Still better than pseudo. Pseudo is nothing, right? But it's insidious because it gets people to do the to think and to think that they are getting all these benefits. But people end up learning what you just said. It's not real, but it takes a long time. And some rationalize that this is, remember the portion where there's no, where the author is talking about it's inevitable. They're just like, oh, well, this is just how it is. Instead of it being super command and control and authoritarian and you kind of feel the cutthroatness, it's, oh, it's a smile and all that. And, but yet, um, for some reason, oh, the company's showing a profit, but we're having mass layoffs. Why, if we're showing a profit, are we having mass layoffs? No, and I don't have any decision making power over that. That's strange, right? So, that that honestly, I thought that I thought that the book was gonna be like that because of the title, the bosses without bosses or employees. I thought it was gonna be. I was so hoping it wasn't, but I thought it was gonna be, hey, pseudo participation, but it's not. So I like that. I mean, we still have to go through the rest and start talking about what's binding. So in here, we have shares and all that. You have the founders still having, it's kind of a veto, like they sold the business and all that. And I'm assuming it's kind of a learning process. And then eventually it's going to turn into people have true legal decision making capability, power, and there's an onboarding process. Everybody goes through all this stuff with these types of businesses. So
What was the name of the book that had the bits about participation that you mentioned?
oh yeah. It's Carol Pateman is the author, and it's called Participatory Democracy.
Just for
And
democracy.
yeah, we got it on the YouTube channel, like all the review of that. I've done a bunch of, I've implemented in a bunch of my talks too, that I've done at conferences. It's really, really good. So yeah, anything else?